So I'm a history major, and I've been thinking lately, why am I doing this? Why am I studying history, or why do we study history in general? Um, because on the surface, it doesn't seem as you know directly applicable to benefit of the human race as other things. Um, you know, people study medicine so that they become doctors and help people live and save lives and stuff. But why do people study history? Why do people spend so much time analyzing text and looking at general trends? And because it doesn't look like it's directly going to like save anyone's life or make anyone's life better. um it's a good question. And one of the main reasons you will hear of why the study of history is important is basically to learn from history and to not repeat the mistakes of the past, which is a valid reason, and I'll get into that later. But I think one reason studying history is important is it helps us understand ourselves and who we are as humans. Just by studying the human experience, we begin to understand more what it is to be human and what is our nature. And we look at throughout history, and we look at all the things that we look at all the behaviors and patterns of humans that haven't changed, despite all the political technological changes that have happened. We look at all the things that haven't changed, and we look at the ways that we're still the same, and that sort of helps us see who we are. There's a song by I want to say Flogging Molly, I could be wrong. um, it's called Sex and Beer. And the song basically talks about, it gives all these examples of history that point to the truth that men will always be motivated by sex and beer. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. It's kind of like, you look back at history and, despite all the things that have changed, humans still are, motivated by, things like honor and, sexual conquest and power and, you know, we're still prone to violence too. Which, although I think we have become less violent as a species, we still are definitely, that's still something that occurs, and so you see that that's part of the human nature. Um, the other sort of area why it's important, like I said earlier, is you learn from history and you learn the mistakes of the past. Um, a common example is people say, don't if you're a general, don't invade Russia during the winter, because they say, oh, Napoleon did it and he failed, and Hitler did it and he failed. So therefore, it's a bad example, bad idea to do that. And you'd also say, Hitler did it and he didn't study Napoleon, and that's why he failed, and so Hitler didn't learn from history. But that's sort of a misconception, and that whole example is sort of a misconception too, because the Mongols did it under Genghis Khan and they were highly successful. But that's for another time. But I think, but yes, I think that's a good reason to study history, is to learn bad ideas. But I think another equally valid reason is to learn good ideas. Is to you look back on history and you see ways people did stuff and things people did, and sometimes you say, what, that's a good idea. We should try that. We should try that in our own society, and and people benefit from it. And that's a reason why we should study history. Good example of that is democracy. The democracy we have in the United States. It's most likely that the people who founded the country and wrote the Constitution, and it's pretty probable that they studied the history of ancient Greece and that area, and looked back and said, oh, democracy, that could be a good idea, especially for preserving the rights that we believe that all humans are endowed with. So we should try this, and after we overthrow the British, we should try this. This is a good idea. That's a good example. Another one I would think, more specific one, would be the federal highway system. In the United States, we have the federal highway system, interstate highway system, that basically its prime function, although most people don't see this on a daily basis, its prime function is to have a good way of transporting military, troops and supplies across the nation in the event of a war. Um, Although it's also open to the public, but our idea for that most likely came from the Germans and the Nazis, who had the Autobahn, and it was President and General Eisenhower that most likely had the experience with the Nazis, and he was able to say, for a while that really helped them. We should try that in our own. Maybe that'll be a good idea, and it was. And the Nazis, or to a lesser extent the Italians of that period, they most likely got the idea from looking even farther back into history at the Romans, who had the Roman road system, and because they were, had a very solid, effective infrastructure, they were able to support and maintain a large empire by means of one, encouraging trade, which is good for the economies, and two, just they were able to, in the event of war, they were able to quickly mobilize and transport troops and supplies across, a large amount of land, and that helped them to, just maintain their empire by force and stuff. And so that's another example of a good idea we see from history. How am I doing on time? Sorry. One thing you need to keep in mind is, with the study of history, is that when you see a good idea or a bad idea, you also do have to study the sort of the context of why that idea failed or succeeded, and you have to study sort of the conditions of the time and the conditions of that specific example. And if you're going to apply it, if you see a good idea, you have to keep in mind the conditions of the time in which you're going to apply it, and how it's different than the conditions of the time when it was first created. For example, the democracy. The Greek democracy was obviously very different than our own, and then it was a direct democracy, whereas ours is representative. There's good reason for that. The founding fathers most likely said, well, that's a good idea, and it worked that way, for ancient Athens, because that was a very small population. But now that we have, these 13 colonies over a large area with millions of people, we might need to alter it a little bit. So they created the representative democracy system, which, so far has, in my opinion, succeeded, both in functioning, logistically and, bureaucratically, and in sort of preserving and protecting some of the rights of people. So, and the other example of don't invade Russia during the winter, before you make the general rule that that's a bad idea, you should keep in mind the context of that. And I think I'm going to make a video about that, because I think that's a very misunderstood example. But yeah, so study history. One, helps us understand who we are, and two, you study history, you learn bad ideas and good ideas. So yeah.